You're listening to 101 Part-Time Jobs, the podcast where I speak to bands and musicians and artists about the times in between making records, in between touring, and their personal survival, whether that's from a practical point of view or an artistic one. I give it to them. I let them roll with it and tell us their story in their own words. Alexis Taylor from Hot Chip joins us on this episode with an oral history of Hot Chip's first few years working at Domino and an excellent story of how he met DFA Records in New York. East London's Signature Brew have been making beers with bands since 2011. They have a new beer with Hot Chip. If you go to their website, signaturebrew.co.uk, you can make an order to be delivered directly to your door. And with the voucher code 101podcast, all capital letters, you can get 10% off your order. Alexis's next solo album, Silence, is coming out on the 17th of September. This is Dying in Heaven Below This. You can pre-order the record from alexis-taylor.com. Thanks for listening. Here's Alexis. Go well. Cheers! What I love to speak to people about and interview people about and really discuss is that kind of idea of playing music full time, but also having that body and soul of working alongside of it, and whatever that entails, whatever that means to make, whether it's paying rent or whether it means keeping inspired and finding new experiences to fuel your art. I mean, you must feel like you've been playing music professionally your whole life almost.
Yes, I do feel like that, really, because it's been most of my adult life. The amount of time spent doing anything professional before it wasn't that long. So I feel lucky in that respect. I did work, but I didn't have to do it for that many years before being signed to a record label that made a difference to whether I needed to work a day job. I
suppose the landscape's changed so much now in terms of deals that are being signed.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that period of time when Hot Chip got signed, was that like a life-changing moment?
It was, honestly, yeah. Before we got signed to EMI, we were signed to Moshi Moshi, and that was life-changing in its own way. Moshi Moshi is a fairly small independent label.
Yeah.
That before them there was another label called Victory Garden Records, and in its own way that was kind of life-changing too, being signed to them. There's small incremental changes in life circumstance. So I was at university at Cambridge, and I had been at school with Joe and Owen from the band before that. And me and Joe made lots of recordings as Hot Chip before we went off to our different places of study. And I went to Cambridge, and just before going there, I guess, or maybe it was I think it was just before going there, we had recorded an EP. And I remember taking it sending it into a label called Victory Garden Records. I'd met somebody in the music and video exchange shop.
Yeah.
They were playing some music in there that I liked. I asked what it was, and it turned out to be somebody who'd gone to school with me. So that was a strange coincidence, but it was kind of very left field, very kind of weird experimental hardcore music by this band Trencher. And,
I've heard of them through Hey Colossus. I've heard of them.
Yeah. So I said, I know that guy Liam. That's funny. And then we got talking about this other band, Fridge, that were from my school. And Fridge had Kieran Hebden in it, who went on to do Fortet. And so they said, we'd love to hear your music. So I sent in this demo that me and Joe had made, and they just said, we'd like to put that out. So they didn't ask for a kind of another stage of, can you improve that or change that, or these are good beginnings, but we want this. So they released that. And the point at which I kind of got that, the reason I mentioned Cambridge is because I can remember vividly getting the email while I was in maybe my first term at university, Jesus College, and I remember just the excitement of this email coming in saying, "We'd like to release your EP."
Amazing.
And then that got released on a CD. Didn't really change very much, except it changed our confidence about things, or at least mine. I thought, well, if that label likes this and will release it, then we can make more music and people will release it. And it was such a small label, I wasn't unrealistic about what that meant. I just liked the fact that somebody thought it was good enough to put out. So by the time we finished at university, we'd made quite a bit more music, and we then began making it a bit more, and we were just trying to get some gigs in London, and somebody recommended that we send a CD to Stephen Bass, and we didn't know who he was, but he ran a night at the Buffalo Bar in Islington.
Yeah.
But by sending him the CD just to get a gig, he said, "Oh, I like this a lot. Do you want to make an album for Moshi Moshi?" which was his label. So we were very fortunate that the person we sent it to just to get a gig happened to run a label, and he worked for a major label as well as running his own independent label, Moshi Moshi. So he was quite well connected. So so we were just lucky in that respect. And so when he said, "Would you like to make an album?" we set about doing that. We'd already made maybe half an album's worth of material. So by this point I was working at Domino record label. And that's in Wandsworth, and Joe from Hot Chip's family house that he was still living in was in Fulham. So I would just kind of walk from Wandsworth after work to his house, and we'd make the album every evening.
Brilliant.
And he was working at another label, Island. So we'd both kind of gone down the route of trying to get jobs in the music industry.
Do you remember how you got those jobs into the music industry? Because it seems a bit ambiguous.
Yeah. So sorry to be jumping all over the place. So basically, all I was going to say is those were the first two stages. And when we got signed to Moshi Moshi, we still continued to have our day jobs at Domino and Island, respectively.
Yeah.
It didn't mean we could stop working. I got my job at Domino because it was advertised on the Domino website. And at this point, I mean, it'd been a few years, but I was a follower of Drag City record label and Domino. I would look at their website quite often and just see what albums were coming out by bands I liked. And I was quite obsessed with lots of things on Drag City and Domino. They shared a lot of artists at that point. This is before Domino had found Franz Ferdinand and Arctic Monkeys that kind of changed the label to be a bigger label, really. So at this point, when I was every week I would probably look at the website. That was as much as I needed to look at the internet back then. I knew the records, but then at some point I saw there was this job opening, and it didn't really say exactly what it was. It said it was like in a kind of, I think it mentioned bookkeeping, which I didn't really know what that meant. And I'd studied English at university, not maths. But it also alluded to doing some stuff to do with the website. And my friend from school called Sam Jeffers, who was in the same band, Fridge, that I mentioned, with Kieran Hebden Fortet, he had built the website for Domino. So I asked him, "What do you think this job really entails?" And he says, "Well, it says it's bookkeeping, but I think they want a more general person to do, they want a bit of bookkeeping and they want a few other things. So I would just apply for it if I were you." So I did that, and then got the job. Fairly quickly realized I couldn't do the bookkeeping at all, but they let me stay. And I just did all the things that weren't the bookkeeping that they needed me to do. So writing about the bands, writing the press releases.
That was in-house, that stuff?
That was in-house. Not all of it was, but some of it was. So it wasn't that I was the PR person. I wasn't phoning people up, and I wasn't the point of contact to explain how good something was to people or sell it to them, but I would do the writing. and I also mailed out the records and CDs that people bought. They had a thing called Domino Mart, and I tried to help them make that a slightly bigger part of their business, because I had worked for like a week at Warp Mart before that, and I'd seen that was doing really big business for them. It was like a massive part of what they were doing. So I was like, well, if you've got a mail order department, it's a bit mad if you're just treating it like a sort of secondary thing. You should try and take it seriously. So I tried to help with that. And I guess I became, in a small way, I didn't sign any bands or anything, but I got given a little bit of A&R responsibility as well, just by listening to demos and recommending things to Lawrence. I would sit opposite him in his own office within the office, like in his own room there, because that was the only spare seat and desk when I got the job. So I was kind of directly opposite the man in charge, and listening to all the new Franz Ferdinand demos as they were coming in, and sort of and just going to gigs every night with him and getting to know him and other people who worked there, and some of whom still work there. So I had a bit of an all-round job.
Did you fit into that culture quite well? I mean, I wonder if you were such a big fan of it before. I mean, were you a bit? I mean, I feel like I'd be really nervous to work at a record label that I loved.
I actually didn't feel too nervous, except for when I had to do the bookkeeping. No, I really liked it. I was definitely excited by having the job, but I wasn't too nervous because it was fun. Most of what I had to do was that another major thing going on at that point was the 10th anniversary celebrations of Domino. So I was just having to help with processing ticket sales for the gigs and organizing the merch for the gigs and stuff like that. And being in an environment where I was listening to records I liked and talking to people about records I liked and working on those records, as well as also hearing records that weren't on Domino but were just what people wanted to listen to in the office. It was exciting to me to be surrounded by fans of interesting music. And then it was expected of you that you'd go to every single gig that they had in the calendar. Wow. So day one, that was revealed to me. And then from day one onwards, I basically went out every night, for the next 2 years, pretty much. And sometimes there was more than one gig to go to. And it was expected of you that you would do that. A few of the more senior members of staff would occasionally say, well, I'm not making it to that one, but I am going to these. But as a new person, it was expected of me that I should show enthusiasm and go to all the gigs. And I generally enjoyed that. So I remember thinking when I was doing that job that I was pretty lucky to have a job I enjoyed. And I'd studied English at university, but I wasn't really feeling like I was trying to pursue further academic work. As soon as I finished, I was already making music. So I felt like whatever I did, I wanted it to do with music. But then at least at this job at Domino, I was writing as well. So I was getting to use that interest in writing a bit.
I mean, when it becomes your world like that, when you're doing that every day and going to all those shows and you're there for, 2 years is a substantial amount of time, especially when you think about everything that you're writing. I wonder if that being your world, you're listening to all this new music. I mean, that must have been such a wonderful thing as an artist to have on the side when you get home from that.
Yeah, it was very inspiring, and also opportunities came our way. Franz Ferdinand were this kind of hot new band at that point, and they were getting Daft Punk to remix a track, and you'd hear that, and feel kind of excited about the fact that that was happening. And then somebody would say, well, that's the CD over there with the stems on it for that track. And I would be like, well, is it okay if I take this and Hot Chip does a remix? And the kind of people that worked with me were like, just don't tell anyone you're doing it, but just do it, and then we'll see what happens, but don't share it with anyone. So we did that. And that remix, I don't think it didn't get released, but we managed to play it to the band. And then, some years later, we worked with them and produced some tracks for them. And it probably helped us to just show that we were keen, I suppose. And we were getting other remix work through Moshi Moshi at this point. So we were working our day jobs. I was working at Domino, and Joe was at Island, and Felix and Al were in Warp, at the Warp Mart.
So all of you were working at these incredible record labels.
Yeah, but doing fairly menial tasks. Although in Joe's case, he had a more kind of, I think he was in the marketing department, so it was maybe a bit better as a job, or in terms of profile, rather than just packaging records and stuff. Yeah. So we were all doing that, and then that we weren't planning it so that we could just learn how the industry works. I was doing it partly because I was passionate about Bonnie Prince Billy, Royal Trucks, Smog, all these kind of records, and I just wanted to work on them, and I got to write the press release for some of those things or talk to those people, and it was interesting to me. But at the same time, you would suddenly realize, I am learning about how things go on behind the scenes, or just being kind of opportunistic as well. Like, mate, is there any way we could support that band? Yeah. And looking back on it, it's quite surprising that we got to support Smog when we weren't really ready. We weren't very rehearsed. We didn't make music that was particularly suited to opening for him, but we liked him. And so we did quite a bad gig supporting him, but we didn't get told never again. It just it just kind of happened. And probably most of the people at Domino weren't there for the support act, maybe, or just didn't affect us negatively.
Yeah.
And then from there onwards, each of those things is an experience, and you kind of learn, we've got to rehearse better, or we've got to be more slick, or we've got to do this, or we've got to do that. You just learn by doing it. But if you never get those opportunities, maybe you just spend your whole life making music in a bedroom and nobody hears it. So I was very lucky that people accepted these requests for, can we do this remix or support that band? And then gradually I moved to working there part-time because we were getting enough gigs for Hot Chip, and it was taking up quite a bit of time. And Joe joined another band called Ardem, which was on Domino. He was a percussionist in that band. That's another person who went to school with us. It's all the people I've mentioned are the same three people in one band called Fridge. Yeah. But they one of them was Kieran, one of them was Sam doing the website, and one was Ardem, who had a record out on Domino. So Joe started to tour. He went on an American and Canadian tour with Ardem, and I think by that point he just had to say to his work, I have to do this. And I guess maybe he used up all his holiday time. And then at some point we got, well, I'm sort of skipping ahead now, but in the short version, we signed to EMI, and that meant we got paid an advance that just was, thinking back on it, quite life-changing, really. It meant we could stop working.
In that in-between time when you were working, did you notice a kind of, clearly, you weren't, shy to tell people, you were doing Hot Chip and you were an artist. But I mean, was there a kind of support within Domino and within your jobs at those record labels to do it, to be an artist?
Yeah, there was. Lawrence was not especially aware, I don't think, of what our band sounded like. He just knew I was in a band and wanted to do that, and he liked me. We're still good friends now. I don't think he'd really listened to much of the music, but he was supportive from a distance. And then Bart, who still works there, was more directly involved. He came to watch us play one of our first gigs around that time, and he was very positive about it. And maybe he made a difference to us getting to support Smog. He was, kind of keen or at least supportive of what we were doing and thought we were interesting. And then over time, I think we became a bit more not notable, but like we'd released stuff on Moshi Moshi. People would come into the office, press people would come into the office to talk to Domino about bands they were working with, but they would also be talking to me because they were going to do our press. So It started to be more obvious that the band I was in was doing something. We got like a nice NME single of the week in the first thing that we put out on Moshi Moshi, which was totally unexpected. Things went well for us, basically.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how to figure out why that happened.
I was about sort of 16 at that time, so I wasn't quite getting into the Buffalo bar. I was going to the Astoria and Mean Fiddler. And as I got older, I sort of discovered the bands I just missed at the Buffalo bar. National and Art Brut. And speaking about Art Brut, so many of these kind of London-centric bands and British bands. And it does feel like it wasn't Top of the Pops, but, NME. If you had a feature on NME, that was a door opening. I mean, it seems that way.
It really was. So we were never a kind of... It's funny, our relationship with NME. We were never featured on the cover, but we were given really nice reviews of that first single and the first album, maybe the second album as well. And then it made, it's funny thinking about it now because the paper doesn't exist anymore. But back then, like Over and Over was listed by them maybe as this track of the year or something. And it didn't do very well commercially. So it seemed quite, maybe it wasn't the number one, I can't remember, but it was somewhere in there. And it seemed like they were supporting quite a lot of more straightforwardly jangly indie bands or Britpop, post-Britpop bands. And yet they gave us space too, and we weren't quite like that. So I always felt thankful to them for, we didn't have the commercial success of some of these other bands, but they seemed to rate us, and that made a difference. It made a big difference back then to get that support from a magazine or paper.
Was that around the time that Reading and Leeds would start having more electronic?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because we played at Reading just before. I think we were on just before Animal Collective on one of the stages, which seems like a kind of good lineup when I think back on it.
Yeah, totally.
I definitely remember that when we first started playing, we were completely different from all other bands we were opening for, because we had 5 people in a row, 4 keyboards and 1 drum machine, everything on a keyboard stand, no drummer. Just a different kind of setup. Whatever it sounded like, it looked different from the beginning. But not that long into doing it, things started to change, and there were other people with, maybe it's like 2 years into doing it or something. You would play at South by Southwest, and you would see bands that would have like an SPDS drum machine at the side as well as drums, and I think LCD Sound System were quite influential in terms of if they had that set up, then other people did it too. But it was maybe coincidence, because I don't know if every band was listening to them by that point. But so it started to feel like we were part of something, not really a scene, but I don't know, we would be on the same, for instance, at South by Southwest, we were on the same bill as Rat-a-Tat, who were on XL, MIA on XL, LCD, and us. And that was a kind of grouping of bands that didn't all sound identical, but there was some crossover between them. And then by that point, that was becoming more the prototype for what other bands might do in terms of how they set up, rather than everybody being the Strokes again.
Did that give you almost like a sense of, I don't want to say validity, because that's not what I'm trying to say, but did it give it a sense of like, oh, this is what we do now. We're on the cusp of something that's actually, really quite special, and actually we should really focus on this big time and make it happen for ourselves.
Well, for whatever reason, we had been very focused on it right from the beginning. Even if we were playing somebody's birthday party from school or playing at a pub in Fulham, I seemed to believe that this was worth doing and worth doing seriously and focusing on, and we must make plans for more gigs and we must make more recordings. And I think Joe felt similarly about the recordings being worthwhile. Maybe he wasn't so sure about us as a band, as a live band. So that determination was there from quite early on, and that's probably how we kind of got going during that working at record labels time. So by the time we were at South by Southwest, we were really making the most of it. We were trying pretty hard to get signed, but we thought we were going to get signed to DFA. That's another part of this sort of story, really. So after being on Moshi Moshi for about a year, we were approached by DFA, and my understanding is that either James Murphy or Jonathan Galkin, who ran the label, had ordered our single Down with Prince from Moshi Moshi, and Moshi Moshi sort of told us this. They were like, "Oh, we're sending it out to James Murphy at DFA in America. That's quite exciting."
Yeah,
and they probably shouldn't have told us that, because then we were like, "Oh well, it's good if they like it." That seems like a more exciting proposition somehow. This cool New York label. We didn't really know that Moshi Moshi was basically as big as DFA, but DFA seemed to be a step up for us,
right?
Just because it was exotic, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I was going out with somebody who I'd met at university, and she was an architect, and she moved to New York to study at the Cooper Union, which is a really good place to do architecture, and she was really good at it and got in. So I would go over to New York to visit her, and while I was there, there was a talk by Brian Eno at her university, and after Brian Eno's talk, there was a Q&A between James Murphy, Trevor Jackson, Hank Shockley from Public Enemy, and Carl Craig. And I went to that, and as I was queuing up to go in, somebody asked me, where did I get my Hot Chip badge from? And I said, well, it's mine because I'm in Hot Chip. And that person was the guy who runs DFA, Jonathan Galkin. So I knew that they had bought the single, but I had no connection to them beyond that. And just because I was queuing up outside this thing, I got talking to him. And then, within a matter of hours, it was like, well, you should come and meet James Murphy and like come to the office, and so he was kind of courting our band, and I was the only member of the band who was over in the States. So I went to the office, met James Murphy, looked around, saw the studio, was just completely excited by any of this happening, and then came back to the UK and just sort of, it just felt like the next stage after the first one was these people in a record shop said, years ago, we run Victory Garden Records, send us your CD. The next thing was Moshi Moshi, and then this was DFA. The next thing was kind of happening. It felt fairly easy, and I suppose it's just something about being quite personable and sociable and not too pushy, but also saying, well, yeah, can I follow up on that? Can I give you my CD? Or
it's like gradient.
Yeah, but then it didn't really happen with DFA. So they said they wanted to sign us, but just nothing ever happened. So we would stay in touch with them because I was in New York again. I met them again, and then at some point we arranged to do a recording session with them. And we some of the band stayed at Tim Goldsworthy's house, and some of us, I stayed at my girlfriend's place in New York, and it all worked out that we did this recording, but they still weren't making the offer to sign us that they said they were going to do. And it dragged on for quite a long time. And I remember just sitting at home waiting by the phone, by the landline, for this phone call that was scheduled to happen. Like, we will speak to you at 2:00 UK time and we'll discuss the deal. And then I would sit there and they just wouldn't call. And I was like, oh, well, they said they were going to call, so they must call. And, you call them and nobody answered. And eventually I'd get through. And it just went on like that for ages, for like months or 2 years or something. I don't know if it was already 2 years, but it felt like it. Felt like we were chasing them, but we weren't sure why they were spending the time recording with us, but not just coming through with an offer. And what it was they just didn't really have any money. So we were sort of looking for this next step up, like how do we leave our day jobs? And DFA weren't really willing to say, we can't offer you the money to do that, but we still want you. So eventually they signed a deal with EMI where everything on DFA, because of LCD Sound System's kind of hype and interest, everything got signed to EMI. So at that point they said, well, we can't sign you directly, but do you want to sign to both DFA and EMI? And we were like, oh, I don't know, because we weren't really thinking of being on a major label. And because I'd worked at Domino, I guess I was still at Domino at that point, I thought it seemed kind of weird to me. I saw the major labels as the enemy.
Yeah.
So that, and then it all just kind of got very complicated. Domino said to me, like, we don't want to step on DFA's toes. But eventually I said to them, well, they're not really actually making an offer, so we don't seem to be signing to them. So then Domino put in an offer. It's quite a good offer. And then Stephen Bass, who ran Moshi Moshi, was like, well, I'm not going to lose them. I'll sign them to Island. And then Island came in with a much bigger offer. And then I was like, oh, I don't want to sign to a major label. All of my bandmates were like, well, this sounds quite good. Why would we turn that down? And then EMI kind of swooped in and said, after seeing us at South by Southwest, they would like to sign us. So we kind of thought, well, if we go with EMI, we still get to work with DFA as well, because they have taken DFA on as part of their label. So then that's what happened, and that was the point at which it was a big advance and meant we could all at once just stop working our day jobs. And
fantastic.
I think what happened after that was a US tour supporting Fortet, and we couldn't have done that without tour support from EMI. So that was a big thing that they helped us with. Like, they paid for us to do an American tour. by doing the American tour supporting Fortet, we then got the next tour, which was our own tour, and by that point we didn't need the tour support. We were getting decent enough offers to just about make it work. So all of these things helped, and I think if we'd signed to Domino or to DFA directly, we wouldn't have had tour support. We might have done a bit of touring and it might have not got anywhere. We don't know. But we were, I was quite conflicted about the major label thing, and yet it helped us massively.
Good to hear a good story for that.
Yeah, I mean, they were nice people and they worked really hard, and I think they were excited to have a band that was a bit different, and maybe also it was a bit easier to work the hot chip music than it was some of the DFA stuff that they'd signed. So it's a bit more pop. And then there was this label in America that was part of EMI called Astralwerks. We were sort of still believing that DFA were going to do everything in America, but they basically didn't. So Astralwerks did it all for America, and they were really into our band. They were great and very, very supportive of us, and so that helped us do well in America, I think, by the fact that we had a good label in the States. I don't know. I seem to be just doing a life story, but
that is brilliant. What an excellent few chapters there. That's a brilliant story, from queuing up to that event in New York and that happening with the FA. I mean, do you believe in serendipity?
Yeah. The funniest thing about that was the badge was on my shoe. It wasn't even like on my jacket or something. I had purple Nike Vandals on, and I had the purple hot chip badge on the tongue of the shoe.
That is so funny. That is so funny.
But also, I mean, this isn't related to getting signed to them or being found by DFA or something, but just going to that talk was really worthwhile as well, just to hear Brian Eno give a sort of seminar, and then to hear about the making of the Public Enemy records by the producer was just really exciting. And I remember both Trevor Jackson and James Murphy, when it was their turn to ask him a question, they both just kind of laughed at the fact that they didn't have any question except how. They were like really sort of, they were stumbling for their words, and they're just like, how did you do it? Whereas everybody else was a bit more like, po-faced and so on, but they just kind of, that you could tell they were in awe of him as a producer, and I was as well. So there was a really, it was exciting and fortuitous that I had this kind of separate reason to be going to New York to visit my girlfriend, and all of the daytimes were spent while she was studying. I was just going around record shops and buying music and kind of absorbing the kind of culture of other music and Kim's record store and Downtown Music Gallery, which stocked all this free jazz music that I was listening to. And so it was very good time to be there.
And that question, how, is always the interesting question.
Yeah. Because those group of people were interested in the process of making records and the production, and that's what interested and still interests me, rather than the kind of life story. I mean, obviously some people have got amazing life stories, but I remember a few years ago there was this good book by Matt Thorne about Prince, and I got sent a preview copy, and I wrote this really glowing review of it, and they used my kind of blurb on the back, and then the book came out and all the reviews were terrible. They were like, oh, it doesn't tell you anything about his personal life. It's really boring. It just goes through what he recorded. And I was like, that's the first book I've enjoyed about Prince, because I wanted to know about all the recordings. Since then there's been about 5 different books that go even more deeply into the recordings, and suddenly they're all like popular, and now there's podcasts about the process of making Sign of the Times. People are getting deeper and deeper into that, but it seemed at that point I guess maybe it was just slightly square journalists or something, just saw it as they just wanted more gossip or something. But I just thought the process is what's interesting to me.
I just learned how they, after a show, they would go to the recording studio after the show.
Yeah, I mean, after the show, he would have an after show gig in a nightclub.
Yeah,
almost every night, wherever he was in the world, and then maybe to the studio as well. That was the thing. When I was growing up as a Prince fan, I would hear about, there's an after show. You've got to be like a member of the Prince fan club to know about where it is or how to get in. And I just thought that happened occasionally in London after the big Wembley show. I didn't realise he was pretty much looking for an after show club everywhere in the world on tour. So he would do like a 2-hour show and then do another 2-hour show, taking you till like 4 a.m. And like you say, then maybe go back and record. So
well done to his tour manager.
Yeah. He just sort of demanded it of people, I suppose. It seems like everybody that worked with him couldn't have a life outside of the recording or the touring. They just couldn't. So some of them did it for a while and then gave up, or others didn't last very long at all.
Yeah, full-time job and a part-time job all in one.
Yeah.
Well, Alexis, I mean, thank you so much for letting me in on all of that. That's amazing. I love all those stories, and thank you for flying with it.
Oh, that's fine. I did do a different job before. I never told you about. It's not even interesting, but I had another job in a CD and DVD and VHS shop called MVC.
All right.
For quite a long time.
Where was that?
Before this, in Chiswick, and then that was like after school finished. After I finished sixth form, but in my year off before going to university. So I did that for most of a year. And then when I finished at university, I did it for a little bit longer until I got the job at Domino. And I did meet my bandmate, Rob, who's in the live band of Hot Chip, in that place. So that was another big part of... That was another job that was just enjoyable because it was music, mainly music fans.
Yeah. Learning something new every day.
Yeah. But I mean, it had its boring sides too. But it was quite... That was like... Yeah, I just didn't want to act like the only job I'd done was in Domino. But I put my time in retail.
Unfortunately, with these stories of retail, there's not loads to talk about, is there?
No. I mean, I served a lot of people from the music industry when I worked in that shop in Chiswick. Members of Primal Scream, Richard Ashcroft would go in quite often. What
would be your sort of... Would you go in for the chat?
Well, some of them were just like... So Elton John had this guy who would buy CDs for every house he lived in. And he would come in every Monday with a printed out list of all the new releases that he was interested in. And he needed 5 copies on CD of all of them. So when that guy came in, you had to sort of serve him for like an hour or so. And then when Martin Duffy from Primal Scream would come in, he would be buying interesting music and you'd get chatting to him about it. And then you'd end up maybe bumping into him after work in the pub in Chiswick and talking to him a bit more. And so things like that would happen. But
Brilliant. Well, we'll have to do a second episode at some point because, of course, the other sort of part-time job of being a full-time artist is... the admin, I suppose, and interviews like this, and which I find equally as fascinating because that stuff is such a part of the job, right? Yeah,
I mean, it was something. We didn't have a manager for a long time at the beginning, so it was split between me and Joe really, doing the admin, and we did some funny tours where we didn't have a tour manager. We didn't have a manager. We didn't have anyone. So we didn't have a sound engineer. We were just traveling around Germany, supporting Faithless in big arenas. And we were just traveling by train and carrying keyboards on our backs in backpacks. And they were wrapped in towels. And
What a wonderful vision.
We were still used to just using beer crates at the Buffalo Bar to put your keyboards on. But suddenly we needed to like play in front of 5,000 people supporting Faithless, and we needed keyboard stands. And I don't know. I don't really know how we managed to do it and still keep like be allowed to play more gigs after that. But maybe we got better as we went on. We just sat down for all of our gigs at the beginning as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
It was just easier to sit down with a keyboard on your lap.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, Alexis, thank you so much, and good luck for the record. It's so exciting.
All right, thanks a lot.
Amazing.
Good to speak to you.
Yeah, you too. So there was Alexis Taylor. His new album Silence is out on the 17th of September. You can pre-order that today. Cheers for listening to 101 Part-Time Jobs. Here is some Sparrer.
I've been working all day for me mate on the side, running around like a blue-ass fly. I've been working all day for me mate. Every big minute I've been on the go, up and down the ladder like a fiddler's elbow. I've been working all day for me mate.
This is a Mighty Moon Media podcast.